You are watching the world 24/7 on the NDTV network. I'm Parmeshwar Bava. Let's begin with the top stories you need to know. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico is no longer in a life-threatening condition after he was shot in an assassination attempt when leaving a government meeting on Wednesday. On the eve of his second visit to China in 6 months, the Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed he backed China's plan for resolving the war in Ukraine, saying Beijing, which has been keen to position itself as an honest broker, fully understood the situation. The United States has introduced new guidelines for H1B visa holders who have been terminated from their jobs, providing options beyond the 60-day grace period. The European Union has agreed on a new migration pact. Mainstream parties hope it will deprive the far right of votes. Meanwhile, the UK Prime Minister has said that his government reduced migration and that student visas are now down by 80%. Wildfires spread across Canada, forcing the evacuation of thousands and threatening several provinces like British Columbia. The Biden administration has told Congress that it plans to send a $1 billion package of military aid to Israel, according to media reports, despite the US's opposition to a full-scale invasion of Rafah and concerns about rising civilian deaths there. France has declared a state of emergency on the Pacific New Caledonia after violent protests flared up against electoral reforms, killing one police officer and 3 others. Well, a big focus. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico is no longer in a life-threatening condition after he was shot in an assassination attempt when leaving a government meeting on Wednesday. In fact, a video captured on Wednesday appeared to show the moment 5 shots were fired at Mr. Fico as he shook hands with a small group of protesters in the town of Handlova. Now, the populist Prime Minister actually won a general election last September and has faced widespread criticism for polarizing politics in this Central European nation, with pro-Russian comments and a push to extend state control over the media. Mr. Fico's return to power actually caused concern among his critics that he, along with his party, which had long been tainted by scandal, would lead Slovakia away from its pro-Western course. He vowed to pursue a sovereign foreign policy, promised a tough stance against migration and non-governmental organizations, and also campaigned against LGBTQ rights. For a quick update from Ground Zero, we have with us Deputy Chief of the Foreign Desk at Pravda, Andrej Matisak, joining us. Well, Andrej, footage shows a man raising a gun and firing multiple times at the Prime Minister before being subdued by his bodyguards. Can you take us through the details of this Wednesday attack?
Prime Minister Fico and his government, they had a meeting outside of Bratislava. That's quite usual. The government likes to go somewhere, from the capital, like also showing people that they care, which is also a political gesture. So there was a meeting of the government, session of the government, and then he went outside from the building when the meeting took place, and there were some people basically greeting him. He approached them, and from what we know, there was one guy who was basically shouting, "Please come to me." He went a little bit closer to him, and then this man started fire. There were a couple of rounds, 2, 3, 4 maybe, and then of course the bodyguards started to act. There are a lot of speculations, and of course some experts are saying that the bodyguards were quite slow. Yes. It's hard to say because the perpetrators were so close. Maybe the problem was that they shouldn't let Mr. Fico to let him that close to the crowd, but he likes to talk to people, and so I think he wouldn't even listen if they would tell him that don't go there. And that had happened. Then they took him to the hospital, and the perpetrator was arrested.
Andrej, we are well aware that Mr. Fico has long been a divisive figure, not just in Slovakia, but beyond as well. But the shooting also comes crucially 3 weeks ahead of the European Union Parliament elections. Do we know anything regarding the motive behind this attack?
But we still don't know why Prime Minister was attacked. But of course, it's very shocking news. Something like that never happened in modern history of Slovakia. I know your country has unfortunate incidents in the past, similar incidents, but it never happened in my country. So we will have to know more about the possible motive of this perpetrator. He was armed with the legally owned gun, and from when we look at the life of this guy, it's very strange, I would even say, because his political beliefs, it seems so, are all over the place. The government is saying that this act was politically motivated, which is the most probable scenario, but I also wouldn't exclude maybe some psychological issues. Of course, and it can go hand in hand, to be honest. So we will see. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you more because simply we don't know at this moment.
We will wait for further details to emerge, but thank you so much, Andrej, for joining us with that quick update. In other crucial news, Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Beijing for his first visit to China of his new term, highlighting the importance of the relationship to Moscow following its invasion of Ukraine. Now, Putin is likely to prioritize countering the US's warnings to China over trade with his country at talks with the President Xi Jinping. Now, the two men toasted their no-limits friendship back in February 2022. It was meant as a counterweight to the global influence of the US. That partnership has increasingly come under pressure as the Biden administration sought to isolate Russia from its Chinese lifeline after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, which began later the same month. But as the Biden administration unveiled tariffs on $18 billion of Chinese imports just on Tuesday, the strength of Xi and Putin's relationship, based on a mutual opposition to a Washington-led global consensus, is likely to be bolstered this week.
Vladimir Putin is in Beijing, landing to a ceremonial welcome, a military parade, welcomed as a friend, which is what Xi Jinping has repeatedly described him as, which is indeed what Vladimir Putin has described the Chinese leader as. And again, highlighting and we've said this for years now, and it remains true, the historic relations between Russia and China, historic in terms of how close they are, strategic cooperation, as well as trade. Vladimir Putin has ahead of him a very rich program. Now, of course, be in Beijing, a meeting with Xi Jinping one-on-one with their delegations. There'll also be a concert marking 75 years since the establishment of relations between Russia, then the USSR, and communist authorities in China. There will, of course, be much to discuss, including foremost perhaps the crisis in Ukraine, the potential Chinese peace plan, which Vladimir Putin says could be the foundations of negotiations, a real sustainable peace deal that could end this conflict, which is of course what everyone wants, but in different ways. Trade between the two countries has reached $250 billion, which for reference is almost twice as high as trade between China and India. There are also huge projects, infrastructure projects, investment projects worth hundreds of billions of dollars between China and Russia, cooperation in military sphere and social sphere, in culture, as well as energy and the peaceful atom, the development of nuclear energy. So certainly a very rich program over 2 days for Vladimir Putin on his first trip after being inaugurated for his 5th term as President of the Russian Federation.
While the wars in Ukraine and Gaza ravage the world, Russia and China grow closer day by day, with Russian President Vladimir Putin off to Beijing on 16th May for his first overseas visit since beginning his 5th term in office. However, it's not just anti-West sentiments that are pushing these leaders closer together. Booming economic ties to mutual interests to reduce US hegemony. This all-weather relationship, as China often calls it, is all set to deepen as the two leaders meet for the second time in a little over 6 months. While optics show a strident partnership between Moscow and Beijing, pressure is mounting on Chinese President Xi Jinping over his alleged support for Russia's defense industry. President Putin's visit comes on the heels of President Xi's 3-nation European tour. As the two countries celebrate 75 years of ties, how will this meeting test the strength of Xi and Putin's relationship? 1. Further strengthening economic cooperation between Moscow and Beijing in the face of Western threats of sanctions. This is high on the agenda for both leaders as Russia continues to face Western isolation and as US unveiled $18 billion of tariffs on Chinese imports this week. Putin will reportedly be traveling with a large trade delegation and will meet Chinese Premier Li Jiang to discuss economic cooperation and further investment. Second, the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline is also expected to be on the agenda. This pipeline is a crucial project symbolizing this no-limits strategic partnership and aims to carry 50 billion cubic meters of gas to China, thus redirecting a supply that once went to Europe. Russia became China's top crude supplier last year, receiving roughly 23 billion cubic meters of gas from Moscow from the original Power of Siberia pipeline. Third, the wars raging on in Ukraine and Gaza are also expected to be on the table. On the war in Ukraine, while Russia remains steadfast on its position, President Putin praised his Chinese counterpart earlier this week for his commitment and backed China's 12-step plan issued last year on ending this conflict. The ensuing conflict in West Asia is also expected to be a touchpoint in the two leaders' discussion as they aim to establish what they call a fair multipolar world order free from the hegemony of the West. All eyes will be on Russia's Putin and China's Xi to see what this growing friendship as well as the upcoming meeting means for the world.
Well, switching tracks to the United States, the US has introduced new guidelines for H1B visa holders who have been terminated from their jobs, providing options beyond the 60-day grace period. But what does this mean for H1B visa holders? Well, a non-immigrant worker's employment ends, either voluntarily or involuntarily. They typically may take one of the following actions, if eligible, to remain in a period of authorized stay in the United States. Either file for a change of non-immigrant status, or file an adjustment of status application, or the third option is file an application for compelling circumstances under which workers may qualify for a one-year employment authorization document. The fourth option being filing an application to become a beneficiary of a non-frivolous petition to change employer. But failure to take action within the grace period may require leaving the country, and if the worker takes no action within the grace period, they, as well as their dependents, may then need to depart the United States within 60 days or when their authorized validity period ends, whichever is shorter. This is what the US government says. Soundarya Balasubramani joins us from San Francisco for further clarity on these changes. Soundarya, thank you so much for making time for us. Take us through how these new guidelines regarding the H1B visa differ to the ones that were in place before.
There is really no difference to the new guidelines. I think USCIS just wanted to remind people that, hey, if you got laid off in the last 6 months, then don't forget that we've published guidelines on what are your options once you got terminated.
Right, but Soundarya, major corporations like Google, Tesla, they've announced layoffs. How do the new guidelines affect those that have been terminated or have a fear of being terminated? And was job termination an existing fear for these workers?
Yes, it is absolutely a fear. I've spoken to hundreds of students and immigrants in the last few months, and it's something that everyone mentioned. I will say that the guidelines that USCIS has published is a very long document with a lot of FAQs. there's a few highlights that I just want to mention for people. So number one, USCIS does let you transfer from whatever visa you're on, say an H1B to a B1 or a B2 tourist visa, so that you can switch to that and then keep interviewing on that visa, which will give you another 6 months to stay in the US. And then hopefully if you get a job, then you can transition back to an H1B or another visa. So USCIS confirmed sometime last year that you can interview on a tourist visa, and that is okay. Secondly, if let's say that you have a compelling circumstance, they have something called a compelling circumstance EAD for those who have an approved immigrant petition. So someone who has an approved I-140 petition, who has a compelling circumstance, which they haven't clearly defined what that means, but a lot of people have applied for that. So that is also another option that you could pursue if you have an I-140 approved. And finally, if nothing works and you have to leave the country, then by law, your employer is supposed to pay for the transportation cost to kind of offboard you from the country and back to your home country. So it's worth asking your employer that if there's no other option for you.
Thanks so much, Saundarya, as always, for joining us with that quick comment. Meanwhile, the European Union has given the final green light to a landmark overhaul of its migration and asylum policies that will see hardened borders and shared responsibility among member states as campaigning heats up for Europe-wide elections next month. Now, this new pact on migration and asylum was officially approved by the 27-nation bloc's economy ministers, ending more than 8 years of work to rewrite the rulebook for handling people who enter Europe without authorization. Now, a majority of member nations backed the reform's 10 pieces of legislation, ensuring its passage despite opposition from Hungary and Poland, which have long rejected the idea that all European countries should take in a share of arrivals. But these new rules, which come into effect only in 2026, they actually lay out the guidelines for screening people to establish whether they qualify for some kind of protection like asylum or deportation if they are not allowed to stay. What can we expect with these new rules in the EU? Well, the new rules lay out guidelines for screening people, so tighter control of migrant arrivals is on the radar. Faster processing at the EU's borders is something we are looking at, and closer cooperation with countries of origin as well as transit. Mainstream political parties believe that this new pact provides answers to questions that have divided nations since more than 1 million refugees and migrants entered Europe back in 2015, mostly fleeing wars in Syria and Iraq. They also hope that these new reforms will starve the far right of vote-winning oxygen in the upcoming European Parliament elections that are scheduled from the 6th to the 9th of next month. But critics say the pact will let nations detain refugees and migrants at borders and fingerprint children. The new measures, they argue, are aimed at keeping people out and infringe on their right to claim asylum and will result in more dubious political deals. Let's get you a quick update from Canada now, where thousands of people in the western part of the country are facing the wrath of wildfires this week amid severe drought. Some 6,000 people were told to evacuate Fort McMurray in Alberta, when 90,000 residents were forced to flee during the 2016 wildfires.
The summer has brought back with it the threat of wildfires in Canada. Here in British Columbia, the wildfires that broke out in Fort Nelson last week now threaten the city itself. 4,500 people have already been evacuated from Fort Nelson and a nearby reserve, but now mandatory evacuation orders are being expanded to other areas as well. For instance, the North Rockies Regional Municipality as well as Fort Nelson First Nation. The General Hospital in Fort Nelson has been safely evacuated as well. However, the winds that are blowing currently in that area are only expanding the wildfire, which is what is threatening the city now. because the wildfire from about 53 square kilometers has expanded to 84 square kilometers currently on Tuesday. And with the present weather conditions, which is the droughts that have been repeatedly seen there, as well as over the next 5 days, no prediction of any rainfall could make matters worse. The emergency response personnel are using helicopters as well as bulldozers to douse the fire. The police have gone knocking at people's doors to ensure that they have left that area. The emergency response service people are making calls to people, asking people to evacuate from that region. And British Columbia is not the only place which is in fact seeing the wildfire. In Alberta, in McMurray, there is a wildfire that is raging as well. However, no evacuation orders have been placed so far, though 68,000 people have been put on alert and they will need to evacuate at short notice if needed. McMurray had seen a tragic incident in 2016 where the wildfires resulted in 1,600 houses being gutted and 80,000 people had to be evacuated. On the other hand, in Alberta, because of the wildfire in McMurray, what we are seeing is a fallout in Edmonton as well, where the air quality has dipped and the visibility is also low. Because of the air quality, people have been asked to stay indoors. In Manitoba, there is a wildfire in Cranberry Portage. 550 people have been evacuated from there. The wildfires last year in Canada were one of the worst in its history, so much so that the plumes from the smoke plumes in fact moved across the border and engulfed many of the cities in US as well, where the air quality dipped drastically last year. Experts believe that these kind of extreme weather conditions which we are witnessing, for instance repeated droughts and dry conditions which are resulting in these wildfires, are to be blamed on climate change, and if that climate action, the manner in which it should be, the thrust should be placed by the world is not dealt with in the manner that it should be, then we will end up grappling with more such extreme weather conditions. In Vancouver, this is Maha Siddiqui for NDTV.
Our government is constantly monitoring the situation, and our Emergency Management Cabinet Committee met again yesterday evening to be briefed and to plan. It's important that everyone know that we are prepared to do whatever is necessary to keep Albertans safe. This evacuation is a stark reminder that our province lives alongside the threat of wildfires and other national disasters. And let me assure you, our government will have Alberta's back whenever a disaster strikes.
In other news, the United States plans to send more than $1 billion in arms and ammunition to Israel, despite growing tensions between President Joe Biden and Israel's Prime Minister Mr. Netanyahu. Officials say this weapons package will consist of around $700 million in tank ammunition, $500 million worth of military vehicles, and $60 million in mortar rounds, as per reports. But getting the weapons to Israel could be a lengthy process. The sale needs to be officially notified to Congress and receive congressional approval. It also comes days after Biden withheld a shipment of bombs to Israel amid rising concerns that the country was gearing up for a major military operation in the southern Gaza city of Rafah. As always, news and updates continue in a moment. We're taking a very quick break. Welcome back. France has declared a state of emergency in New Caledonia after violent protests flared up against electoral reforms, killing one police officer and 3 others. New Caledonia is a French overseas territory located hundreds of miles off Australia's eastern coast. But this violence is the worst seen in decades and is the latest flashpoint in long-running tensions with Paris. Well, thank you for investing your time and watching this edition of The World 24/7. We keep tracking the latest developments for you. Do stay tuned.